My father's car was a ghost. It haunted the single-car garage attached to my small rented house, a hulking, seafoam green relic from a time I barely remembered. It smelled of him, old leather, stale pipe tobacco, and something metallic and vaguely sweet, like antifreeze. I kept it for the smell alone. I kept it because it was the last solid thing he'd ever given me, a 20-year-old sedan with more rust than paint and a personality that could only be described as cantankerous. My life had become a series of quiet routines built around this car's many failings. The trip to the grocery store was a gamble. A drive to the art supply shop was a high-stakes adventure. My world had shrunk to the size of what was accessible on foot, or what I was willing to risk the car for. It was a life painted in shades of beige and gray, muted and predictable. I was an illustrator, working from a small desk in my living room, my most meaningful interactions taking place through email. Loneliness was a low, constant hum in the background of my days, a frequency I had long ago learned to ignore. Until the day the ghost finally gave up. It happened on a Tuesday. The engine didn't roar to life. It didn't even sputter. There was just a sad, defeated click, followed by an unnerving silence. I tried again. Click. Silence. The sound of absolute finality. I rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel, the cracked vinyl pressing a temporary pattern into my skin. This was it. The last tether was cut. For a full minute, I just sat there, breathing in the familiar scent, a lump forming in my throat. It wasn't just a car, it was a four-wheeled mausoleum, and I was its reluctant, lonely curator. My friend Sarah, when I called her in a state of quiet panic, was brutally practical. She didn't offer condolences for the machine. She gave me a number. His name is Julian, she'd said. He works out of his own place. He's honest, and he's good with old beasts like yours. Don't take it to a dealership. They'll skin you alive. So I made the call. A voice answered on the second ring, low and calm, with a texture like gravel rolling under a heavy boot. It was a voice that didn't waste words. I explained my situation, the make, the model, the soul-crushing click of its demise. He said he could come by in the afternoon to take a look. And that was it. The simplicity of it was almost jarring. I spent the next few hours tidying my house, a nervous, pointless energy buzzing under my skin. I didn't know why I was cleaning for a mechanic. It felt absurd. Yet, I found myself dusting surfaces that hadn't seen a cloth in months and hiding my more chaotic piles of sketchbooks and paint tubes. I was preparing my quiet, beige world for an intruder. He arrived precisely at 3. I heard the crunch of tires on my gravel driveway and peered through the blinds. A dusty, dark blue pickup truck, old but immaculately kept, was parked behind my dead sedan. A man climbed out, and he was not what I had expected. I had pictured someone older, thicker, with a friendly but dismissive air. The man walking toward my front door was tall and lean, moving with an easy, unhurried grace. He wore dark, grease-stained jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that fit snugly across his shoulders and chest. His dark hair was cut short, practical, and his face was all clean lines and sharp angles, softened slightly by a day's worth of stubble. As he got closer, I saw his eyes. They were a dark, indeterminate color, and they were taking in everything. The peeling paint on my porch railing, the overgrown flower beds, the house itself, with a quiet, assessing intensity. I opened the door before he could knock. "Julian," I asked, my voice sounding thin and reedy to my own ears. "Leo," he confirmed. His gaze met mine, and it was steady, unblinking. It felt less like a glance and more like a diagnostic check. For a moment, I had the unnerving sensation that he could see the rust and failing parts inside of me, too. A slow heat crept up my neck. He wasn't smiling, not exactly, but the corner of his mouth tilted up just slightly. It wasn't a grin, it was an acknowledgement, a flicker of something knowing and maybe a little amused. "Yeah, hi, thanks for coming," I mumbled, stepping aside to let him in, then immediately realizing he was here for the car, not for a cup of tea. It's in the garage." "This way." I led him through the house, acutely aware of his presence behind me. He was quiet, his work boots making soft, solid sounds on my hardwood floors. He smelled of something clean and sharp, like industrial soap, mixed with the faint, not unpleasant scent of motor oil and metal. It was a smell that was utterly foreign in my world of turpentine and paper. It was the smell of something real and tangible. In the garage, he circled the old car like a predator studying its prey. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked. His hands, I noticed, were clean, but the lines were etched with old grease, his knuckles scarred with small, faded white lines. They were capable hands. He ran one of those hands along the fender, a touch that was surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. "She's seen better days," he said, his voice a low rumble in the enclosed space. It wasn't a judgment, just a statement of fact. "She was my dad's," I offered, the words feeling like a weak justification for the car's existence. He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the car. "They don't make them like this anymore. All steel and hard." He finally looked back at me. "Pop the hood." I did, and he leaned over the engine bay, his focus absolute. I stood back, watching the muscles in his back and shoulders shift under his t-shirt as he worked. He moved with a practiced economy, no wasted motion. He was completely absorbed, and I was completely absorbed in watching him. For the first time in a very long time, a vibrant, unfamiliar color was bleeding into the edges of my monochrome life. And it was the color of a stranger's gray t-shirt in the dim light of my garage. He spent what felt like an hour just looking, testing, gently probing the car's mechanical guts. I stayed nearby, a silent, awkward sentry. I should have gone back inside, left him to his work, but I found I couldn't. I was mesmerized by the quiet competence of his labor. The way he'd bite his lower lip in concentration, the faint furrow that appeared between his brows. These were tiny details, micro-expressions that probably meant nothing, but my artist's eye snagged on them, cataloging them away. Finally, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag he pulled from his back pocket. "All right," he said, turning to face me. "I know what it is." "Is it bad?" I asked, my stomach twisting with the familiar dread of an expensive repair bill. He gave that slight, one-sided smile again. "It's not great. Your starter's shot, completely corroded. And from the looks of it, your alternator is on its last legs. You've been having trouble with the lights, right? Dimming when you idle." I just nodded, amazed. I had been having that exact problem for months, writing it off as just another of the car's endearing quirks. "Yeah, I thought so," he said. "It's all fixable. But some of these parts," he trailed off, his gaze going back to the engine. "They're not exactly sitting on a shelf at the auto parts store. I'll have to do some digging. So, it's going to take a while. A week. Maybe 2, he said, his eyes meeting mine again. "I can do the work here, if you want. Save you the towing fee. I'll just need to come by a few times." A few times. The thought sent a strange, complicated flutter through my chest. It was a mix of financial anxiety and something else, something I couldn't and didn't want to name. It was the thought of this quiet, focused man re-entering my space, bringing his scent of oil and soap, his steady presence, back into my quiet house. "Okay," I said, the word coming out a little too quickly. "Yeah, that works." He gave a short, decisive nod. "I'll source the parts and call you with an estimate tomorrow." He started to turn, then paused. His eyes scanned the garage, lingering on a stack of canvases leaning against the wall. "You a painter?" "Illustrator, mostly," I corrected, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I paint for myself." He nodded again, a slow, thoughtful gesture. "Right?" He didn't say if they were good or bad. He didn't offer any empty praise. He just acknowledged it, filed it away. And somehow, that felt more meaningful than any compliment. He walked back to his truck, and I watched him go, a tall, solid shape against the bright afternoon sun. As he drove away, the crunch of gravel fading, the silence he left behind felt different. It was heavier, more noticeable. The hum of my loneliness was suddenly a little louder, a little more insistent. The ghost in my garage was no longer the only thing haunting me. The days that followed fell into a new, strange rhythm. Julian would call or text, brief, functional messages, to let me know his progress on finding the parts. "Located a starter in Ohio. Shipping will take a few days," or "found an alternator, but it needs to be rebuilt." Adding a day or 2 each message was a small, electric ping that disrupted the placid surface of my day. I found myself checking my phone constantly, a habit I'd never had before. I was waiting for his name to flash on the screen. It was pathetic, I knew, but it was also the most exciting thing that had happened to me in years. When the first part arrived, he texted me. "Got the starter. Can I come by this afternoon to install it?" My heart did a stupid little leap. I replied with a simple "sure," as if his presence in my garage was the most normal thing in the world. I spent the morning pretending to work, sketching aimlessly in my notepad, my focus completely shot. I kept glancing out the window, watching the empty driveway. When his truck finally pulled in, the sense of relief was so profound it was almost embarrassing. I let him get to work, hovering in the doorway between the kitchen and the garage, telling myself I was just making sure he had everything he needed. It was a lie, of course. I was watching him. I watched the way he laid out his tools on a weathered canvas roll, each wrench and socket in its proper place. There was a meticulous order to his work that I, a person who lived in a state of organized chaos, found deeply fascinating. He worked with a quiet intensity, his movements fluid and sure. The sounds of his labor became the soundtrack to my afternoon. The metallic click of a socket wrench, the low groan of a rusted bolt giving way, his soft grunt of effort. I made a fresh pot of coffee and brought a mug out to him. "Thought you might want this," I said, my voice startlingly loud in the relative quiet. He looked up from the engine. A smudge of black grease now streaked across his cheekbone. His eyes were focused, and it took them a second to adjust to me, to register my presence as something other than a shape in the periphery. "Thanks," he said, his voice a little rough from disuse. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his rag before taking the mug. His fingers brushed against mine as he took it. A brief, incidental contact, but a jolt of warmth shot up my arm. It was nothing. It was everything. He took a slow sip of the coffee, his eyes closing for a moment in appreciation. "That's good," he murmured, his gaze falling on my sketchbook, which I'd left on the workbench. He nodded toward it. "What are you working on?" I felt that familiar flush of heat. "Oh, nothing. Just some character sketches for a children's book." He walked over and, with a silent, questioning look that I answered with a hesitant nod, he picked it up. He flipped through the pages slowly, his expression unreadable. I held my breath. My art was the most personal part of me, the part one rarely showed anyone. He was seeing the clumsy first drafts, the half-formed ideas, the raw, unfiltered contents of my head. He stopped on a page filled with studies of an old, grumpy badger in a waistcoat. A small smile touched his lips, the first genuine, unambiguous smile I'd seen from him. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the stern focus. "He looks like he needs a good cup of coffee," Julian said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. He's the villain. He's angry because his prize-winning marrows keep getting stolen. Julian chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "By a band of rogue squirrels, I assume." "Foxes, actually. They're very sophisticated," I said, a smile finding its way to my own face. We stood there for a moment, a mechanic with grease on his cheek and an illustrator with ink on his fingers, talking about thieving foxes. The garage, usually a place of silent frustration for me, felt different. It felt full. He handed the sketchbook back to me, his calloused thumb brushing against the edge of the paper. "You're good, Leo," he said, his voice quiet and serious. He turned back to the car, and just like that, the moment was over. But the words hung in the air, simple and direct. "You're good." He wasn't talking about the car. He was talking about me. And my foolish, lonely heart latched onto it like a lifeline. The alternator took another week to arrive. During that time, the silence from Julian was a palpable thing. The house settled back into its quiet, beige routine, but now the quiet felt empty. I found myself sketching his hands, trying to capture the confident way they held a wrench, the map of scars and grease etched into his skin. I drew the furrow between his brows when he was concentrating. I drew the hint of a smile that played on his lips. My sketchbook, usually filled with whimsical animals and fantastical landscapes, was suddenly filled with him. It was a secret obsession, a way to keep his presence alive in the house while I waited. The text message, when it finally came, was almost a shock to the system. "Rebuilt alternator is here. I can finish the job tomorrow morning." I felt a ridiculous surge of joy. Tomorrow morning. I spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation, cleaning again, planning what I would say, what I would do. It was all so stupid. He was a mechanic fixing my car. This was a business transaction. But my insides didn't seem to understand that. My insides were preparing for a reunion. He arrived just after 9, the morning sun glinting off the chrome of his truck's grill. He looked tired, I thought. There were faint shadows under his eyes. But he gave me a small nod and that familiar, subtle smile as I opened the door. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Ready to bring the beast back to life?" "More than ready," I said, leading him to the garage. I tried to busy myself in the house, to give him space, but the pull was too strong. I ended up back in the doorway, a book open in my lap, pretending to read. I watched him work, the familiar ballet of his movements as he leaned into the engine bay. After about an hour, he let out a low curse. "Problem?" I asked, looking up from my unread page. He sighed, pulling his head out from under the hood. He held up a small, frayed belt. Fan belt's completely worn, on the verge of snapping. "It's a miracle it hasn't already." He tossed it onto the workbench with a grimace of frustration. "I don't have a replacement for this model with me. There's a specialty shop that might, but it's over in West Creek." "How far is that?" "Couple hours drive," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I can go get it, but it'll kill most of the afternoon." An idea, bold and reckless, sparked in my mind. It was so out of character for me that I almost dismissed it immediately. But the thought of him leaving, of the house falling silent again, was more than I could bear. I could come with you," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "My car's obviously out of commission. I could use a change of scenery, and I could pay for gas and lunch." Julian looked at me, his expression unreadable. I felt my face flush, certain I had overstepped, that I had made our simple business arrangement weird and complicated. I was already backtracking, stammering an apology. "I mean, you don't have to. It was just a thought. I'm sure you'd rather go alone." "Okay," he cut in, his voice calm and even. I stopped, blinking. "Okay, yeah," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. This time it reached his eyes, making them shine. "Okay, Leo. Let's go for a drive." The cab of Julian's truck was another world. It was clean and orderly, but undeniably his. The air smelled of him, that faint scent of soap and metal, now mixed with the subtle, warm aroma of coffee from a travel mug in the center console. It was a comfortable, lived-in space. As we pulled out of my driveway, leaving the silent, crippled sedan behind, it felt like a small escape. The world outside the truck's windows seemed brighter, the colors more saturated. For the first 20 minutes, we drove in a comfortable silence. I was a bundle of nerves, replaying my impulsive invitation over and over in my head. What was I thinking? What were we even going to talk about for 4 hours? I stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar suburban landscape blur into rolling countryside. It was Julian who broke the silence. "So," he said, his eyes on the road. "Thieving foxes. What's their motivation?" I turned to look at him, surprised. "What?" "In your book," he clarified, glancing at me. "The foxes who steal the badger's marrows. Why do they do it? Are they just malicious? Or is there a deeper reason?" I couldn't help but smile. "They're gourmands. They believe the badger's soil has a unique terroir. They're not stealing. They're liberating the marrows for a higher culinary purpose." He let out that low chuckle again. "Of course they are. A sophisticated motive for a sophisticated animal." He shook his head, a genuine smile on his face. "I like that." The question opened a floodgate. I started talking about my work, about the worlds I created on paper, the personalities I gave to squirrels and badgers and foxes. I told him how I'd loved to draw since I was a kid, how it was the only thing that ever made me feel like I was any good at anything. He listened. He didn't just hear the words, he listened. He'd ask questions, smart questions, that made me think about my own stories in a new way. He wasn't just humoring me, he was genuinely interested. Then, I turned the tables. "What about you?" I asked. "Why old cars? You could probably make a lot more money at a dealership working on new ones." He was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the steering wheel. "I did that for a while," he said, his voice losing some of its easy warmth. "After I got out of the army, I hadn't known he was in the army. It was another piece of him, another layer I hadn't suspected. At a dealership, you're not a mechanic. You're a part swapper. The computer tells you what's wrong, you pull out the old module, you plug in the new one. There's no thought to it. No soul." He gestured vaguely at the dashboard of his own truck. "These old machines. They have personalities. They have histories. You have to listen to them, figure out what they're trying to tell you. It's a puzzle. And when you solve it, when you get that engine to turn over and purr just right, there's no better feeling. He spoke about engines and transmissions the way I spoke about character arcs and color palettes. With passion, with a deep, abiding respect for the craft. I saw a side of him that was hidden under the quiet competence, a vulnerability and a passion that I hadn't expected. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a caretaker, a historian, a doctor for forgotten things. Just like me, in a way. I took care of my father's car, a forgotten thing. I illustrated stories about animals, small, forgotten worlds. We were both curators of a sort. The auto parts shop was a dusty, cavernous place that smelled of rubber and oil. Julian seemed to know the old man behind the counter, and they spoke a language I didn't understand, a shorthand of part numbers and engine codes. While he conducted his business, I wandered the aisles, looking at the strange, alien shapes of carburetors and gaskets. After a few minutes, Julian found me. "Got it," he said, holding up the new fan belt like a trophy. Last one they had in stock. On the way back, we stopped at a roadside diner, a classic silver and red affair with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner. We slid into a booth opposite each other. The air was thick with the smell of fried onions and coffee. It was so normal, so mundane, yet it felt monumental. I couldn't remember the last time I'd shared a meal with someone like this. "My treat," I insisted when the waitress came. "For the ride." Julian didn't argue. He just gave me a small nod and ordered a burger and a black coffee. I ordered the same. We ate in a comfortable quiet, the only sounds the clink of our cutlery and the low hum of the diner. I watched him eat. I watched the way he held his burger, the way he looked out the window at the passing cars. I was cataloging more details, more small moments. The way a stray bit of sunlight caught the silver flecks in his dark hair. The steady, rhythmic way he tapped his fingers on his coffee mug. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. The question caught me off guard. "Leaving? Leaving what?" "This town," he said, his gaze meeting mine across the table. "Your house. All of it. Starting somewhere new." I thought about it. I thought about my beige life, my quiet routine, the ghost in the garage. "No," I said, the answer surprising even myself. "I mean, I used to. All the time. But not anymore. It's my home. It's quiet. I can work. There's a history here." I thought of my father's car, of the house he'd helped me find. My roots are here, I guess, even if they're a little tangled. He nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine. "Roots are important," he said, and it felt like he was talking about more than just staying in one town. It felt like he was talking about something deeper, something about being grounded, about having a place to belong. The rest of the drive back was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers. It was a shared, comfortable silence, filled with the unspoken things we had learned about each other. It was the silence of two people who had, unexpectedly, found a point of connection. When we pulled into my driveway, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The day had vanished. It was the fastest day I had lived in a decade. A storm was rolling in from the west, the sky a bruised, ominous purple. The air was thick and heavy, charged with electricity. Julian worked quickly, trying to beat the rain, his movements sure and efficient in the fading light. I stood in the garage doorway, watching as he expertly threaded the new fan belt into place. He was completely focused, a man in his element. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering against the driveway. Then, the sky opened up. It was a torrential downpour, a wall of water that blurred the outside world into a gray smear. A loud crack of thunder rattled the house, and in the same instant, the lights in the garage flickered and died. We were plunged into a deep, disorienting darkness. The only light came from the occasional, brilliant flash of lightning that illuminated the garage in stark, ghostly detail, freezing Julian's silhouette against the pale green of the car. "Well," his voice came out of the darkness, startlingly close. "That's not ideal." "The power's out," I stated the obvious, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't the storm or the darkness that scared me. It was the sudden, absolute intimacy of our situation. We were trapped. Just us. My heart picked up pace. "I've got a flashlight in the truck," he said. "Stay put." I heard him moving, a series of sure, careful steps. A moment later, a powerful beam of light cut through the blackness, finding me in the doorway. I had to shield my eyes. He walked back toward me, the flashlight beam dancing around the garage. You got candles? Yeah. In the kitchen, I said, my voice a little shaky. Somewhere. He followed me into the house, his flashlight beam our only guide. The house felt different in the dark. Smaller. More intimate. The familiar spaces were transformed into a landscape of shadows and secrets. We found the candles in a drawer and a book of matches. He lit one, his large, capable hands surprisingly steady. The small flame flickered to life, pushing back the oppressive darkness and casting a warm, dancing glow across his face. The planes and angles of his cheeks and jaw were thrown into sharp relief. He looked like a figure from an old painting. We spent the next few minutes lighting candles and placing them around the living room. The house was filled with the soft, flickering light and the faint, sweet smell of melting wax. The storm raged outside, a wild, chaotic symphony of wind and rain, but inside our small bubble of candlelight, it was quiet and still. We sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa, a few feet of space between us that felt both like a vast chasm and no space at all. The easy conversation from the truck was gone. The air was thick with a new kind of tension. It wasn't awkward, it was charged, like the air before the storm. Every small sound was magnified. The hiss and pop of the candle wicks, the frantic drumming of the rain against the windows, the sound of my own breathing, which seemed ridiculously loud. I was acutely aware of him, of his solid presence beside me in the dark. I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I could smell the rain on his clothes, mixed with his own unique scent. So, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in my chest. The quiet life. I looked at him. His face was half in shadow, his eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering light. It's not so quiet right now, I said, trying for a lightness I didn't feel. He didn't smile. He just watched me, his gaze intense. It was that same diagnostic look from the first day, but this time it felt different. It felt more personal. It felt like he was trying to see past my carefully constructed walls, to the lonely, yearning person hiding behind them. You look at me like you're trying to solve a puzzle, Leo, he said, his voice soft but direct. What are you trying to figure out? The question hung in the air between us, a stark and unavoidable truth. My breath caught in my throat. My mind went blank. All the witty retorts, all the deflections I usually employed, they all deserted me. I was left exposed, stripped bare by a simple question in a dark room. I could lie. I could make a joke. I could pretend I didn't know what he was talking about. But I was so tired of pretending. I was tired of the beige and the gray. I was tired of being an observer in my own life. I stared at the flickering flame of the nearest candle, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The whole world had shrunk to this single, quiet moment. The storm outside, the dead car in the garage, the half-finished illustrations on my desk, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the man sitting next to me and the unbearable weight of the truth. I finally turned my head to look at him. His expression hadn't changed. He was just waiting, patient, giving me the space to find my words. The silence stretched, filled with the roar of the storm and the frantic beating of my own heart. I feel it now, a trembling that starts in my hands. This is it. The precipice. I'm not trying to figure anything out, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The words felt thin and fragile in the heavy air. I took a breath, a shaky, inadequate thing, and forced myself to meet his gaze. His eyes were so dark in the candlelight, deep and patient. I think I just like looking at you. There it was. The pathetic, simple, unvarnished truth. It hung between us, terrifying and liberating all at once. I expected him to laugh, or to look away in discomfort, or to get up and make an excuse to leave. I braced myself for the familiar sting of rejection, the cold wave of humiliation. But Julian didn't do any of those things. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just held my gaze, and a slow, profound change came over his expression. The quiet intensity softened, replaced by something else, something vulnerable and raw that mirrored my own fear. A flicker of understanding, of recognition. He saw me. He actually saw me. He closes the space between us. It's not a sudden movement. It's a slow, deliberate drift, like two celestial bodies finally succumbing to a long unacknowledged gravity. He lifts a hand, and his fingers, calloused and warm, gently cup my jaw. His thumb brushes against my cheek, a feather-light touch that sends a tremor through my entire body. My eyes flutter shut. I can't watch this happen. I can only feel it. The first touch of his lips is soft, questioning. It's not a kiss of passion, not yet. It's a moment of inquiry, a silent question asked and answered. I lean into it, a small, involuntary movement, and that's all the answer he needs. The pressure deepens, and his other hand comes to rest on the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me steady, holding me there. And then, the world falls away. There is no storm. There is no dark room. There are no ghosts. There is only this. The taste of him, clean and tasting faintly of the coffee we shared hours ago. The rough, pleasant scrape of his stubble against my skin. The solid, grounding weight of his hands on me. The soft sound of his breathing mingling with my own. It is not like anything I have ever imagined. It is not frantic or desperate. It is slow and deep and sure. It feels like coming home after a long, lonely journey. It feels honest. After a lifetime of muted colors, this feels like pure, undiluted pigment. It is everything. When he finally pulls back, it is only by an inch. Our foreheads rest together, our breath mingling in the small space between us. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't have to. I open my eyes and find his watching me, dark and searching in the candlelight. The silence that follows isn't awkward or heavy. It's a silence of communion, of a truth finally spoken and acknowledged without a single word. He laces his fingers with mine, his grip firm and warm. A simple connection, a new beginning. The storm still raged outside, but for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt perfectly, unequivocally safe. I woke to the unfamiliar hum of the refrigerator. The storm had passed, and sometime in the early hours of the morning, the power had returned. Sunlight, pale and watery, streamed through the living room window, illuminating the scene from the night before. Melted puddles of wax on the coffee table, 2 empty coffee mugs, the sofa cushions askew. It all looked so mundane in the harsh light of day, a stark contrast to the candlelit magic of the darkness. I was on the sofa, a blanket tucked around me, and I was alone. A cold knot of panic tightened in my stomach. I sat up, my heart starting to pound. Julian was gone. Of course he was gone. The storm had passed, the power was back on, the spell was broken. Last night was a fluke, a strange aberration brought on by darkness and confinement. He'd woken up in the clear light of morning and regretted it. He'd slipped out while I was sleeping to avoid the inevitable, crippling awkwardness. The familiar, crushing weight of my own loneliness settled back over me, heavier than before now that I'd had a taste of what it felt like to be without it. I pushed myself off the sofa, my body stiff and sore. I walked into the kitchen, my bare feet cold on the floorboards, half expecting to find a note. A hastily scrawled apology, maybe, or just a bill for the car repairs left on the counter. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the appliances and the smell of fresh coffee. My head whipped around. On the stove, my old percolator was bubbling softly, filling the kitchen with a rich, warm aroma. And sitting at my small kitchen table, a mug cradled in his hands, was Julian. He was wearing the same clothes from yesterday, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked up as I entered, and his expression was quiet, watchful. He wasn't smiling. The silence was excruciating. I stood frozen in the doorway, my panic giving way to a profound, gut-wrenching awkwardness. What was I supposed to say? Good morning? About last night? Every possible sentence died in my throat. I just stood there, clutching the doorframe, feeling like a fool. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving my face. He looked tired, but his gaze was clear and steady. He was waiting for me to say something, to give him a cue. My mind was a frantic, buzzing blank. The beige was flooding back in, washing everything out, telling me this was a mistake, that I had misread everything. Finally, he set his mug down on the table with a soft click. Last night, he said, his voice low and a little rough. It wasn't just about the power being out, Leo. The knot in my stomach loosened, just a fraction. I swallowed hard, finding my voice. It wasn't. No, he said simply. He pushed the chair opposite him out with his foot. An invitation. I walked over and sat down, my movements stiff and uncertain. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine where it rested on the worn wood. His touch was warm and solid, a grounding anchor in the churning sea of my anxiety. His thumb stroked the back of my hand, a slow, deliberate gesture. I've been wanting to do that since the first day I saw you standing in your doorway, looking like a startled deer. A shaky laugh escaped me. A startled deer? Is that what I looked like? Yeah, he said, and the corner of his mouth tilted up in that small, familiar smile. A startled deer who draws grumpy badgers and makes incredible coffee. He squeezed my hand gently. I woke up this morning, and I didn't want to leave. Relief washed over me, so potent and overwhelming it almost made me dizzy. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a fluke. It was real. I turned my hand over and laced my fingers with his. I woke up and thought you had. I confessed, my voice quiet. His smile faded, and his expression turned serious. No, he said, his gaze unwavering. I'm not going anywhere. Unless you want me to. I don't, I said, the words coming out stronger and more certain than I thought possible. I really, really don't. We sat like that for a long time, hands clasped on the table, the percolator bubbling on the stove, the morning sun filling the kitchen. We didn't need to talk. The reassurance was in his touch, in the steady calm of his presence. The harsh morning light didn't seem so exposing anymore. It just seemed bright. Later that morning, Julian went out to the garage to finish his work. The professional reason for his presence in my life was coming to an end, and a new kind of anxiety began to creep in. The car had been the bridge between our two separate worlds. Without it, what was left? Would this fragile, new connection just dissolve? I watched him from the kitchen window as he leaned over the engine, his movements as sure and practiced as ever. It looked the same as it had before, but everything was different. An hour later, he came inside, wiping his hands on his ever-present rag. She's done, he announced. Give it a try. I followed him out to the garage. He stood back, leaning against the workbench, arms crossed over his chest, watching me. I slid into the driver's seat. The familiar smell of my father, of old leather and tobacco, filled my senses. It didn't feel like a ghost anymore. It just felt like a memory. I put the key in the ignition, my hand trembling slightly, and gave it a turn. The engine roared to life, a deep, steady, powerful sound I hadn't heard in years. It didn't sputter or cough. It purred. A wide, incredulous grin spread across my face. I looked over at Julian, and he was smiling, a real, full smile of pride and satisfaction. It works, I said, the words full of wonder. Told you, he said. All steel and heart. Just needed a little convincing. I turned the engine off, the sudden silence feeling peaceful rather than final. I got out of the car. This was it. The moment of truth. The transaction was complete. I braced myself for the bill, for the handshake, for the "it was nice working with you." He pushed himself off the workbench and walked over to me. He didn't pull out an invoice. He just stood in front of me, his gaze soft. The car's done, he said quietly. My heart sank. Here it comes. Right? I said, trying to keep my voice steady. How much do I owe you? That's not what I meant, he said. He reached out, his hand coming to rest on my arm, his touch sending a familiar warmth through me. The car's done. But I'm not, he paused, his eyes searching mine. I was thinking, my truck could probably use a tune-up tomorrow. The brakes feel a little soft. Maybe you could come over to my place and supervise. Make sure I do it right. The offer was so simple, so transparent in its intention, that I almost laughed with relief. It wasn't an ending. It was an invitation. A conscious choice to continue, to build a new bridge now that the old one was no longer needed. Supervise? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I don't know the first thing about brakes. A slow, roguish grin spread across his face. That's okay, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. I'm a very good teacher. The next day, I drove my father's car for the first time in months. The engine hummed, steady and strong. The ride was smooth. I wasn't gambling or taking a risk. I was just driving. I followed the directions Julian had texted me, leaving my familiar neighborhood behind and heading out toward the more rural edge of town. His place was down a long gravel road, a small, neat house with a massive, detached four-car garage that was clearly the property's main attraction. His blue truck was parked outside. I found him in the garage, leaning over the open hood of a vintage muscle car, its cherry red paint gleaming under the overhead lights. The place was immaculate, tools hanging in perfect order on pegboard walls, engine parts arranged neatly on metal shelves. It smelled of oil and polish and hard work. It smelled like him. He heard my footsteps on the concrete and looked up. The smile that lit up his face was open and unguarded, and it sent a flutter through my chest. "Hey," he said. "You made it." "I'm here to supervise," I said, holding up a paper bag. "I brought coffee and donuts. For the crew." He chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag as he walked toward me. "Good. The crew is starving." He took the bag from me, our fingers brushing. He peered inside. "You got a maple glazed. You're a keeper." He didn't stop there. He leaned in and pressed a soft, firm kiss to my lips. It was easy and natural, a simple greeting that felt more intimate than anything that had happened in the storm. It was a kiss that promised a normal, everyday kind of happiness. We sat on a couple of overturned buckets, drinking coffee and eating donuts, the half-repaired engine of the muscle car our backdrop. He told me about the car, its history, the work he was doing to restore it. I told him about a new book idea that had sparked in my mind, about a lonely badger who learns how to fix things from a quiet, steady fox. He listened, his head tilted, a thoughtful smile on his face. There was no tension, no awkwardness. There was just a quiet, comfortable intimacy. The feeling of being in the right place, with the right person. I looked around the garage, at the orderly tools and the powerful machines. Then I looked at him, at the smudge of grease on his temple and the genuine warmth in his eyes. My whole life, I had been an observer, standing on the outside looking in, painting worlds that were more vibrant than my own. But sitting here, in this garage that smelled of oil and coffee, I didn't feel like an observer anymore. I felt like I was a part of the picture. I thought about my little house, about the ghost that no longer haunted my garage. The quiet wasn't lonely anymore. It was just peaceful. The beige walls didn't seem drab. They seemed like a blank canvas, waiting for new color. I had spent so long feeling like a broken-down machine, full of rusted parts and frayed wires, just waiting to click into a final, defeated silence. And then Julian had come along. He hadn't fixed me, but he had shown me how to pop the hood, how to listen to the engine, how to see that I was all steel and heart. I just needed a little convincing. He finished his coffee and stood up, stretching his arms over his head. "All right," he said, his voice full of easy energy. "Time to get to work. These breaks aren't going to supervise themselves." He held out a hand to me, his palm open, his fingers strong and sure. "You coming?" I looked at his hand, then up at his face, at the hopeful, open expression waiting for me. And for the first time, there was no hesitation, no overthinking, no fear. I just smiled, and I took his hand. It felt like I'd finally come home.